Hello, my name is Michael McLean, and I'll be presenting this lecture on behalf of Ken Irvine, who developed it. You've arrived at Topic 2 of this online course on Fundamentals of Freshwater Health. This lecture focuses on freshwater ecosystem services. Here are some learning objectives to help us with the content and its relevance. At the end of this session, participants will be able to distinguish key categories of ecosystem services in freshwaters, identify the link between ecosystem services and environmental integrity, be aware of the history of ecosystem services and how we can use the concept to support policy for the protection of freshwaters, and discuss how ecosystem services can help in identifying trade-offs of natural, social, and economic capital. Views of the natural world can be markedly different, from understanding the threats of development to the celebration of the taming of nature. The Hoover Dam on the Colorado River in the USA, the largest dam built at the time, was seen as a crucial leap for energy and water storage. It was presented at the time as a triumph of man over nature. The simple words of the poet Rabindranath Tagore foretold, from one perspective, the environmental impact of the taming of nature. Whatever our view of dam building or our needs to harness the goods of nature, it's a simple fact that we all depend on functioning ecosystems, as illustrated in this graphic from a United Nations Global Sustainable Development Report. Indeed, as humans, we are inextricably linked to an unavoidable transaction with nature. We can think of natural capital as the world's ecosystems, which we use to produce economic capital, and from that build up social capital. How far we can utilize the goods of nature varies in different situations, and there are differing opinions in how far we should or need to exploit the natural environmental capital. The conversion of environmental capital to economic capital has undoubtedly brought wealth, but often with a cost on environment quality. The extraction of minerals, removal of forests, and damming of rivers all have a consequence. The impacts of the exploitation of nature usually affect different sectors or human groups differently. Economic growth can support social capital, but it can also have negative effects on human societies. This idea of balance across exploitation of nature and benefits for society has some very interesting historical roots. Some examples are provided in the slide. The ancients did not have the term we now know as ecosystem service, but there was an awareness of the benefits of keeping exploitation of nature within some limits, often embedded in cultural norms. In the case of the Code of Hammurabi, there were quite severe penalties for transgressors. In more recent times, we've moved from the often tacit knowledge of the past to quantifying and using science as the basis for the need to place limits on the extent of exploitation of the natural world. The 1960s and 1970s saw increasing global awareness and some very popular science writing by, for example, Carson and Schumacher. The so-called Club of Rome used mathematical models to quantify limits to growth, and the term environmental and later ecosystem services started to be used. The milestone report by the Brundtland Commission, Our Common Future, that arose from the first Global Earth Summit, or UN Conference on the Human Environment, outlined the principles of what was needed for what was coined sustainable development. The use of the term ecosystem service in scientific literature and increasing adoption in policy discussions gained traction in the 1990s. This period helped develop and clarify the concept and linked the importance of ecosystems with supporting human well-being. In a subsequent Earth Summit, there was little room for doubt on the threats to the natural world and the consequences of that for human societies. Attention was beginning to be paid to the economic costs of the loss of ecosystem integrity and wasteful use of ecosystem services. This move by mainstream economic thinking provided a more tangible link between ecosystem services and economic capital. The assumption that loss of environmental capital translated to more net economic capital was being shown to be a dangerous one. The often quoted phrase of the Commission on Water that free water is wasted water became a bit of a clarion call for the need for more attention to the fallacy of what were often perceived as free goods of nature. As in any housekeeping, goods and services are seldom really free. Emerging from the Earth summits, the current and mainstream thinking of ecosystem services was laid out clearly in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment Report, Ecosystems and Human Well-Being. The report outlined 3 key objectives. Number 1, identify options that can better achieve core human development and sustainability goals. Number 2, better understand the trade-offs involved across sectors and stakeholders in decisions concerning the environment. And number 3, align response options with the level of governance where they can be used most effective. For those who are interested in reading more about the history of ecosystem services, see the paper by Lele et al. In Europe, a consolidation of the water policy of the European Community was laid out by the EU Water Framework Directive. This policy was primarily designed to provide a coherent assessment of water quality in aquatic ecosystems using biotic indicators, with legally binding environmental objectives. It was noticeable that in the introductory section of the directive, it is stated that water is not a commercial product like any other, but rather a heritage which must be protected, defended, and treated as such. This provides a clear signal about the value of water and aquatic ecosystems. This idea of water as a heritage has global applicability for wise use and conservation of water and the ecosystem services it provides. Many countries face water scarcity as a fundamental challenge to their economic and social development. By 2030, over a third of the world population will be living in river basins that will have to cope with significant water stress, including many of the countries and regions that drive global economic growth. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment provided what is a well-accepted definition of ecosystem services: the functions and products of ecosystems that benefit humans or yield welfare to society. You will find a variation of this theme in reports in the scientific literature. Indeed, as the concept becomes more widely used, the ideas around what it means also evolve. For this course, we will use the thinking of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and how that report divided ecosystem services into a number of components. Ecosystem services embraces natural to managed ecosystems, and in the slide you see both a highly managed ecosystem in Rwanda and a natural ecosystem in Croatia. When thinking about what comprises an ecosystem service, a number of quite different possibilities can be recognized. These range from tangible goods that can be used directly to less obvious services. Goods that can be used directly with an obvious physical form or traded in traditional markets are generally referred to as provisioning services. Examples include food, water, and materials for building or shelter. Other benefits that humans derive from ecosystems have a less obvious physical form, but are necessary for the processing of matter or the functioning of an ecosystem. These are known as regulating services. They include local or global climate, underlying processes that determine water supply, the capacity of soils to store carbon, and biotic interactions and effects that lead ultimately to food supply. A good example of this is pollination by insects. Intact ecosystems can often provide a buffer to extreme weather or geological events. The protection afforded by mangrove forests to low-lying coastlines is a well-known example. Regulating services can often involve complex chemical and biotic interactions, as is the case with nutrient cycles, such as for nitrogen. A breakdown of regulating services leads to what we can term as disservices. A separate category of ecosystem services includes services that provide cultural benefits, including supporting spiritual beliefs, education, recreational possibilities, and the simple pleasure and mental well-being from being surrounded by the natural world. Grouping ecosystem services into different categories is a means of ecosystem classification. Common uses of different types of provisioning ecosystem services may also lead to competition among uses and the stakeholders that use them. Reliability of water supply and its so-called consumptive use can be a major source of conflict when supply is limited. Exploitation of biomass produced by ecosystems can lead to conflicts of supply and demand and can be notoriously difficult to manage. In a world where human pressures on ecosystems are low, regulating services play a vital role for the ability of humans to continuously benefit from the services provided. Increasing human-induced pressures on the environment can lead to a diminishing value of those services, and to the transition from what can be considered very obvious benefits for users to a shift of benefits among users, or under severe pressures, a general collapse of those benefits for all or most users. Remember the simple diagram of the overlaps of environmental, economic, and social capital. Human evolution and adaptation to the surrounding environment provided for a deep-rooted connection between human societies and the natural world. Despite the structure of modern societies, this appreciation of the world is observed across modern activities. It can range from the simple appreciation of the beauty of nature to religious ceremony and belief, and using nature for recreation. Underpinning all ecosystem services are the so-called supporting services. These can be seen as the structure of the environment on which humans depend. Sometimes it is an interesting discussion as to whether a supporting service should be classified as a regulating service. Different models of ecosystem services classification may group these in different ways, but here we follow the model provided by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Supporting ecosystem services can also be known as habitat ecosystem services. The different types of ecosystem services are summarized in this well-known figure from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Pause the video if you'd like to review it in more detail. Now let's take a little quiz to assess what you've learned so far. You'll be presented with a photo in each of the next 4 slides. Examine the photos and choose which category of ecosystem service you can see with your own eyes. As we come to the end of this introductory session on ecosystem services, we can try and sum up the connection of ecosystem services with natural and environmental capital on the one hand, and human well-being and livelihoods on the other. The natural capital in this example incorporates social and human capital, which produces man-made capital. Human well-being and livelihoods results from the different ecosystem services. You will notice that in this model, pollination and nutrient cycling are considered supporting services. In human societies, the management of natural capital and the enabling environment that influences, promotes, or diminishes human well-being and livelihoods is closely connected with the formal and informal institutions which all human societies are part of or influenced by. The institutions have important consequences for the management of natural resources and therefore natural capital. As a utilitarian concept, ecosystem services have strong links to economic value. Not all value can be easily priced, and one reason why we see a decline of natural habitats and environmental integrity is that values of many services are under-recognized or considered as free goods. If we try and use economic models to value ecosystems, there is a range from what we can consider direct use value to existence value. Direct use value can be relatively easily valued, either through market price, such as a fish, or the willingness to pay, as for access to culture or recreation. Putting a price on something that has indirect use value is more difficult, although still quite possible. In between use and non-use value is something known as option value for how current society might use and value services for possible future use. The bequest value considers how future generations might use and value a service, and existence value is the most difficult to price, as this also enters the realms of deep personal opinions and philosophy. An approach to economically value water and wetlands has been developed by TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity for Water and Wetlands. It was promoted by the Ramsar Convention Secretariat with financial support from the Norwegian, Swiss, and Finnish governments and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. The Institute for European Environmental Policy leads the process, with co-authors from the Convention on Biological Diversity Secretariat, the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, Wetland International, and the Ramsar Secretariat. It received hundreds of comments and contributions from experts. It's free to download, and it's a very useful overview of how to go about assessing the value of aquatic habitats, as well as the economic valuation of that. One thing sure is that as a society we tend to undervalue the goods and services provided by ecosystems. In this diagram, the global economic value of different ecosystems is compared. The units are US dollars per hectare per year from 2007. Note the log scale on the x-axis. That brings us to the end of this lecture. To summarize, this session has distinguished key categories of ecosystem services and connected these with environmental integrity. A brief history of ecosystem services was provided to help us place the concept in a modern context. It has illustrated how ecosystem services can help in identifying trade-offs of natural, social, and economic capital, and provided an overview of the link with economic valuation. Thank you for listening, and I now encourage you to go on to the additional activities from this session to deepen your understanding further.